I never imagined that my father's meticulous estate planning would be the catalyst that tore our family apart. As I sit here in my office at the historic preservation firm where I work as a senior architectural conservator, I need to share this story. Every detail, every emotion, every painful decision. Let me start from the beginning. I'm Liam Mitchell, 35, and I specialize in preserving historic buildings in Seattle. My father always envisioned this path for me, though not quite in the way it turned out. Architecture is where history meets the future, he would say proudly after I was accepted into the architectural program at UW. While he ran a successful construction company focusing on historical restorations, he had an uncanny ability to see the value in preserving the past while embracing the future. Back in the late 1980s, during a major recession, Dad built his restoration business from nothing. He took on the challenging projects other contractors avoided, armed with just his truck and his carefully maintained tools. Mom often told me stories of their early days, living in a tiny apartment, being frugal with every penny. But Dad never wavered in his vision. The secret isn't just in restoring buildings, he would tell me. It's about preserving the stories within their walls. That philosophy carried him through the toughest times. What made Dad's company special was his approach to both clients and workers. He would often lose bids to competitors who promised unrealistic deadlines, but he never compromised on his principles of transparency and honest timelines. Trust is the foundation of everything we build, he would say, and he was right. By the mid-1990s, his company had become renowned in Seattle for tackling complex restoration projects that required both technical expertise and a deep respect for historical authenticity. During the 2008 financial crisis, when construction companies were folding left and right, Dad's business stayed afloat. He didn't lay off a single worker. Instead, he cut his own salary to zero and even mortgaged his beloved Mustang. I learned more about leadership watching him navigate that crisis than I could have from any university course. Your crew isn't just employees, he would tell me. They're the guardians of craftsmanship. Those lessons shaped my own career more than I realized at the time. When I became project lead at my firm, I implemented detailed documentation systems for our restoration processes, just as he had maintained meticulous records for every historical building he worked on. His emphasis on building strong relationships with both clients and craftsmen helped me guide my team through challenging preservation projects. I met Hannah at a historical architecture symposium during my junior year. She was studying business administration with a focus on managing cultural heritage sites. Despite my disheveled appearance after spending hours in the architecture studio, she was intrigued by my passion for preserving historical buildings. Dad fell in love with her immediately. She understands the value of heritage, he told me after their first dinner together. Don't let her get away. After graduation, Dad even helped Hannah establish her own cultural heritage consulting firm, introducing her to his network of preservation specialists and teaching her how to navigate the complex world of historical restoration contracts. Success in preservation isn't just about knowing the techniques, he would say. It's about helping others appreciate the stories behind every brick and beam. Family traditions. Hannah and I made it a tradition to drive to my parents' house every Sunday for dinner. We would gather on the back porch Dad had lovingly restored, its weathered wooden boards telling the story of countless family meals. He would fire up the grill while we talked about everything, from the intricate details of my latest preservation project to the historical features he discovered in his current restoration work. Even when the technical aspects of architectural preservation went over his head, he'd ask thoughtful questions about the challenges of maintaining historical integrity. Mom would playfully roll her eyes, saying, "There they go again with their old buildings talk," but her voice always carried a note of pride. The house itself was Dad's masterpiece. He had purchased it with the proceeds from his first major restoration project in the 1990s, a Victorian mansion that put his company on the map in Seattle's preservation community. It was a stunning craftsman-style home, complete with a wraparound porch and original woodwork that he had painstakingly restored. The garage he had transformed into his workshop was a testament to his dedication to craft. Every tool hung in its designated spot, each historic restoration technique documented in detail. A historic home is like a living museum, he would say while teaching me how to maintain the original gutters or inspect the century-old foundation. He kept a rigorous maintenance schedule, from checking the slate roof after winter storms to maintaining the original wood windows. Neglect the historical details, and you lose the story of the house, he would remind me. The workshop wasn't just a storage space. It was a classroom where Dad taught me the art of historic preservation. He had renovated it himself, adding period-appropriate storage solutions and a workbench specifically designed for teaching me traditional woodworking techniques. Every piece of historic wood has a story to tell, he would say as we worked. The carefully organized wall of restoration tools wasn't just about order. It was his way of teaching me that preserving history requires both respect and precision. Those weekend lessons in the workshop became the foundation of my career. When I was 12, Dad bought a 1967 Mustang, claiming it would be our father-son restoration project. That car became a hands-on lesson in both mechanical restoration and historical preservation. His guidance, which still influences my work today, was clear. Always use period-appropriate tools and materials, and quick fixes destroy historical value. While he could have completed the restoration in months, he stretched it over 3 years, teaching me every aspect of historical preservation along the way. We photographed each step, documented every original part, and maintained detailed restoration logs. This isn't just about restoring a car, he would say. It's about learning to respect and preserve history. Those lessons proved invaluable in my career as a preservation architect. Early marriage. After Hannah and I married, we bought a small historic cottage about 20 minutes from my parents' house. Dad insisted we take out the mortgage ourselves, though he helped with the down payment. Building your own history is as important as preserving others, he explained. On weekends, he taught me how to restore the original features of our home, from repairing century-old crown molding to preserving the vintage hardwood floors. He was preparing me not just for homeownership, but for a life dedicated to preservation. My career in architectural preservation was flourishing. I had just been promoted to lead conservator, overseeing a team specializing in historic building restoration. Despite the long hours and complex challenges of maintaining historical accuracy while meeting modern building codes, I loved every minute. Dad would call during my lunch breaks, not to discuss anything specific, but just to check in. He understood the pressure of balancing preservation with progress. Remember to delegate, he'd advise. You can't restore an entire historical district alone, just like I couldn't preserve these old buildings by myself. The beginning of the end. When Dad first started showing signs of fatigue, Hannah and I were discussing starting our own family. Despite Mom's pleas, he kept postponing his doctor visits. Just busy with the Portland restoration project, he'd dismiss our concerns. He was working on his largest preservation project yet, a multi-million-dollar historical district renovation that would have secured his company's legacy in Pacific Northwest preservation. Looking back, I wish I'd pushed harder for those medical checkups. Maybe things would have turned out differently. The business was expanding rapidly. Dad was talking about taking on more historical preservation projects throughout the Pacific Northwest, having just opened a second office in Portland. He'd built a reputation for updating historic buildings while maintaining their original character. The key is to honor the past while preparing for the future, he would tell his clients. This philosophy of preservation influenced everything he did, both professionally and personally. Our final meaningful conversation happened in his workshop, discussing the Mustang's restoration. His eyes lit up as he talked about entering it in the Pacific Northwest Classic Car Show, saying, "Let's show people how to properly preserve automotive history." He was still making plans for the future, right until the end, eager to share his passion for preservation with a new generation. The day everything changed. It started like any other morning. I was in an early meeting discussing the preservation plans for a Victorian-era mansion when my phone buzzed. Something made me step out to take the call, though we were in the middle of reviewing crucial historical documentation. Mom was crying so hard she could barely speak. Dad had collapsed at a restoration site. By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack. He was only 58, with so many historical buildings left to preserve. The aftermath. The weeks following Dad's death were a blur of grief and paperwork. The funeral drew crowds. Preservation specialists, craftsmen, even competing restoration companies came to pay their respects. Everyone had a story about how Dad had influenced their approach to historical preservation. One elderly craftsman told me how Dad had kept him on payroll during a long illness, saying, "Your father understood that preserving skills was as important as preserving buildings." The company's artisans were devastated. Many had worked with Dad for decades, sharing stories I'd never heard. How he'd funded a foreman's daughter's architectural studies, helped another through a divorce, or stayed late teaching apprentices the nuances of historical woodworking. The company's conference room became an informal memorial, filled with photographs of restored buildings and handwritten notes from clients and preservationists alike. The estate. Dad's preparation for the future was as meticulous as his restoration work. His attorney, Gabriel Winters, called us in a week after the funeral. He pulled out an enormous accordion file labeled Heritage Preservation Protocol in Dad's careful handwriting. Inside were dozens of carefully organized documents, each detailing different aspects of his estate. Mr. Winters spent 3 days walking me through Dad's legacy. Each color-coded folder contained not just legal documents, but personal notes explaining his decisions about preserving both his business and our family home. In 35 years of practice, I've never seen an estate plan this detailed, Winters remarked. Dad had even included a 5-year transition plan for his restoration business, with contingency plans for various scenarios. New developments. Mom started attending a grief support group at her church. That's where she met Marcus Reeves, 58, one of the group facilitators who had lost his wife 2 years earlier. At first, she would just mention him in passing. Marcus suggested this book about healing, or Marcus says it's normal to feel this way. Even though it seemed quick, I was glad she had support. Hannah reminded me that everyone processes grief differently. The support group met every Tuesday evening, and soon Mom was attending more church functions with Marcus. Coffee after services evolved into lunch meetings, then dinner dates. Our family friends started expressing concern about the rapid progression of their relationship. At a family gathering, my Aunt Jane pulled me aside, worried that Mom was rushing into something new to fill the void Dad left. Changes begin. The changes in Mom became increasingly apparent. She cut her hair, changed her wardrobe, and most distressingly, removed the heritage rose garden Dad had helped her cultivate with historically accurate varieties. Whenever I questioned these changes, she'd say, "It's time for a fresh start." The woman who used to spend hours sharing stories about Dad's preservation projects now barely mentioned him. Everything moved faster than any of us anticipated. Just 6 months after Dad's passing, Mom announced that Marcus was moving in. His grown children, Tyler, 30, and Brooke, 32, claimed it would bring new life into the old house. I tried to be understanding, but it felt like she was rushing to erase everything Dad had carefully preserved. Standing in the workshop he'd so meticulously maintained, surrounded by the tools of historic preservation, I found myself at a crossroads. How could I protect Dad's architectural legacy while supporting Mom's need to move forward? Hannah advised finding a balance, but I couldn't shake Dad's words from his letter. Son, preserve our heritage. First signs of trouble. Marcus's domineering attitude had always bothered me, but now he began acting as if he owned the historic home Dad had left to me. Last month, he initiated a major renovation project without consulting me. When I visited one weekend, contractors were tearing out the original built-in bookshelves Dad and I had restored together, his final preservation project before his illness. Marcus stood supervising, telling workers to just throw all that old woodwork in the dumpster, as if he were the property owner. These weren't just shelves. They were part of the house's historical character, crafted from quarter-sawn oak that Dad had personally sourced to match the original 1920s woodwork. When I confronted him, Marcus responded with barely contained contempt. "Look, son," he said, emphasizing the word mockingly. "This house needs modernizing. Your father's preservation work was, well, outdated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the property value." When I reminded him that any modifications required my approval as both owner and a preservation specialist, he just laughed. "Your mother and I live here," he said. "We don't need permission to upgrade our home." Mom sided with him, of course. "Marcus knows about modern real estate trends," she said. "He's just trying to help." The same woman who once cherished those bookshelves, proudly displaying her collection of period-appropriate antiques during Christmas, now acted as if they were mere obstacles to progress. When I showed her Dad's detailed preservation plans for the house, she dismissed them as dwelling in the past. Deteriorating situation. The relationship with Marcus's children grew increasingly tense. Tyler had converted Dad's preservation workshop into a CrossFit gym, destroying years of careful organization designed for restoration work. While I was away at a historic building conference, he held a garage sale, selling most of Dad's specialized restoration tools, irreplaceable antique implements, essential for authentic preservation work. Meanwhile, Brooke treated the historically significant house as her personal renovation project, painting over the original wood paneling and replacing Dad's carefully restored hardwood floors with modern vinyl planking. One evening after dinner, Marcus cornered me in what used to be Dad's study. "Since we're living here, maintaining this old house, we should have our names on the deed." "It's only fair," he said. I had to explain that they weren't paying a mortgage because Dad's planning had paid for the house in full. They weren't even covering basic expenses. I was handling all maintenance costs, preservation expenses, insurance, and property taxes. Hannah suggested we stop our weekly visits now that little Sophie was here. She was right. The tension in that house wasn't good for anyone. But stepping back only emboldened Marcus. He started sending me bills for improvements I'd never approved, making more and more unauthorized changes to the historic property. Mom's sister called recently, insisting I should be more understanding of Mom's new life. When I tried to explain Dad's intentions for preserving the house and my legal obligations as a preservation architect, she accused me of being stuck in the past. "Marcus makes her happy," she argued. "Why can't you just let them modernize the house?" The final straw. Then came the discovery that broke my heart. They had removed the growth markers from the kitchen door frame, erasing years of family history. Every birthday, Dad would measure my height, marking it with a date and a note about that year's preservation projects we'd worked on together. "It's just an old door frame," Mom said when I confronted her. "We can't keep every piece of wood just because your father documented preservation work on it." Now I spend more time sitting in Dad's restoration chair, the only piece of original furniture I managed to salvage. in my own garage. Gabriel Winters advises me to consider long-term solutions. Legally, the house is mine, but I'm facing difficult decisions about its future. When does being labeled the bad guy become worth it to preserve your father's architectural legacy? And how do you maintain the moral high ground when your entire family opposes your preservation efforts? Breaking point. I appreciate all the advice I've received about preserving historical integrity. The situation has reached a critical point, and I've finally made a decision that will likely change everything. Last week, I met with my financial advisor about the property. With neighborhood property values up 40% in 3 years, we could generate significant rental income, enough to fund Sophie's future education while maintaining the house's historical character. During our discussion, I realized I'd been so focused on the preservation aspects that I'd overlooked the financial impact of allowing Mom and Marcus to live rent-free while they systematically destroyed the home's historical features. When I brought this up during our weekly call, Mom exploded. "You can't do this to us," she screamed into the phone. "This is our home." Marcus has put so much work into modernizing it. She refused to listen when I tried to explain. I was just exploring options, continuing to defend their unauthorized improvements to the historic property. An hour later, Marcus called, his tone lacking its usual arrogance. "Listen here," he declared. "We've built a life in this house. You can't just evict us because you're clinging to your father's outdated preservation ideas." When I tried to discuss the financial aspects, he interrupted, claiming they had sweat equity in the property. I reminded him that legally, the house was mine. Dad left it to me for a reason, to preserve its historical integrity. His response was cold. "Your father isn't here anymore. You need to think about the living." The final decision. After consulting with Hannah and Gabriel Winters, I made my decision. The next day, I arrived at the house to find Mom and Marcus in the middle of another unauthorized renovation, ripping out the original crown molding Dad had carefully matched to the house's historical period. That was the final straw. "You have 2 weeks to find another place to live," I informed them. Mom burst into tears, accusing me of being cruel and heartless. Marcus tried intimidation, arguing about my inability to throw them out on the street, and listing their local connections, his job, their church, their neighborhood friends. I maintained my composure, channeling Dad's steady approach to difficult restoration decisions. "This is my property," I stated firmly. "Dad left it to me to preserve its historical character, and I'm exercising my legal right as owner." The confrontation. Marcus's face reddened as he listed all the money they'd spent on modernizing the property. I informed him, as a preservation specialist, that their unauthorized alterations had actually diminished the house's historical value. The situation escalated when Brooke joined the argument. Mom immediately weaponized her pregnancy, crying, "How can you do this to your stepsister? She's carrying a child." Though Brooke's pregnancy was significant to them, I had to explain that it didn't affect my property rights, and more importantly, she wasn't my stepsister. This was about preserving my father's legacy. The aftermath. Since then, I've faced an onslaught of emotional manipulation. Mom's entire family has united against my preservation efforts. Her sister called in tears, claiming their parents were worried about Mom's safety. Marcus's brother, a real estate agent, left messages about the challenging rental market. Even distant cousins I barely know are sending lengthy messages about Christian values and family loyalty. The hardest part is dealing with family friends who've known me since childhood. People who watched me grow up working alongside Dad now express their disappointment in my decisions. Each call feels like another betrayal of their understanding. Some even suggest I'm damaging Dad's reputation in the preservation community. But they're missing the point. This isn't about profit or cruelty. This is about honoring Dad's vision and preserving the historical features he dedicated his life to protecting. It's been excruciating watching them methodically destroy his preservation work. This house was his legacy to the architectural community. I've covered all their expenses, allowed them to live rent-free for years, and tolerated their unauthorized modifications to historical elements. Eventually, enough is enough. They have 2 weeks to make alternative arrangements, and I'm standing firm against Mom's pleas for more time. Gabriel Winters assures me the law supports my position, and I've been more than generous. He's helping prepare the formal eviction notice, ensuring everything is properly documented. I know this makes me appear villainous in others' eyes, but sometimes protecting historical preservation requires difficult choices, even when others disagree. That's another lesson I learned from Dad. Final days. The 2-week deadline has passed, marking the longest fortnight of my life. Every day brought new attempts at emotional manipulation and increasingly desperate efforts to change my mind. Mom tried everything, her calls alternating between rage and tears. "I changed your diapers," she'd say one day. "I sacrificed everything for you," she'd scream the next. Marcus changed tactics, attempting negotiation instead of intimidation. He proposed a formal lease and offered to start paying rent. But after witnessing how they treated Dad's careful preservation work, I couldn't trust any agreements they might make. The intervention. 3 days before the deadline, I arrived to find a crowd gathered on the front lawn. Mom had assembled an intervention group. Church friends, family members, and even some of Dad's former business associates. For 2 hours, I listened to people criticize my decision to preserve the house's historical integrity. Mom's pastor spoke about honoring your parents. Dad's old secretary tearfully recalled his generosity. And my elementary school teacher reminded me of the values my father had taught me. The most challenging moment came when Brooke stood up, hands protectively over her pregnant belly, speaking about how stress could harm her unborn child, while Mom wept beside her. Several church ladies glared at me disapprovingly. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. The turning point. But something unexpected happened during this ambush. As I sat there listening to everyone talk about Dad, people who hadn't even attended his funeral, suddenly claiming to know what he would have wanted for his historic home, I felt a strange sense of calm. Dad's words echoed in my mind, "Stand firm when you know you're protecting something valuable." I stood and addressed the group, describing Dad's meticulous planning for the house preservation and how he had carefully restored every historical detail. I showed photographs documenting Marcus's unauthorized modifications, including the destroyed period features and craftsmanship they'd replaced with modern fixtures. Finally, I presented Dad's letter outlining his reasons for entrusting me with preserving the house's historical character. Some of his older colleagues nodded as I read his thoughts about trust, responsibility, and preserving architectural heritage. They understood because they'd known Dad, really known his dedication to historical preservation. The end. Soon after, the crowd dispersed. While some still looked disapproving, the righteous indignation had faded. A few even quietly apologized as they left. Mom and Marcus returned inside without a word. On the deadline morning, I arrived with Gabriel Winters and a locksmith. As a precaution, I'd hired security, though they weren't needed. The house was empty, their remaining possessions loaded into Marcus's truck. As he helped Brooke into his pickup, Marcus couldn't resist one final jab. "Are you proud of yourself? Your father would be so impressed with how you've treated your mother." I didn't respond. Dad would have understood. I know he had anticipated this possibility. Why else would he have been so specific about preservation in his will? Assessment. Walking through the house after they left, I finally grasped the full extent of the damage. They had replaced original fixtures with builder-grade materials, painted over handcrafted woodwork, and completely altered Dad's workshop. While I won't pursue damages, Gabriel documented everything for legal purposes. I just want to focus on restoring what can be saved. Several of Dad's old preservation specialists have already offered to help rebuild the historical features that were removed. Aftermath. Mom is staying with her sister now. Most of my relatives have cut contact, though some still call to lecture me. On social media, Marcus's children continue posting emotional updates about their poor mother being evicted, but the responses are dwindling. Through everything, Hannah has been my anchor. When I doubt myself, she reminds me of Dad's letter and his faith in my commitment to preservation. Eventually, I'll tell Sophie about her grandfather and the architectural heritage he worked to preserve, but she's too young to understand now. Moving forward, I'm working with a historical restoration specialist to return the house to its original state. We can preserve the spirit of Dad's work, though some changes can't be undone. The workshop will be restored first. Where I learned from my father is where I want Sophie to learn about preservation. Sometimes being viewed as the villain is the price of protecting historical integrity. While I may never repair certain family relationships, I can live knowing I preserved what my father entrusted to me. As Dad used to say, integrity means doing what's right for preservation, even when it's difficult, not taking the easy path. I believe he would understand.